you okay? Okay, you there. All right. Guys, I just wanted...
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to thank you very, very much for coming. Firstly, not only do I want to thank you for coming to this shiur dedicated to my late mom, but also coming to the house so that my brother and I could do Kaddish because he's in quarantine at the moment. And I really, really appreciate the effort that you guys went through, those of you that are in South Africa. And those of you that are in Israel for attending the shiur, just want to share a picture. I just want to share a picture of my mom, just give you a bit of an idea. For those of you that didn't meet her, most of you did, I think, is that, as my brother said, when he gave a shiur this evening after Ma'ariv, that my mom had this very special affinity to Chanukah. We didn't grow up from, but the reality is she did have a deep connection to Chanukah. And in our house, we didn't know that it was the men that had to light. So my mom lit for the family, and she was enthusiastic about doing mitzvahs. Really, she was. And thank God my parents sent both my brother and I to Yeshiva College, which was Menorah Primary in those days, and it provided a great foundational learning in terms of hashkofa and halachas, etc. But my mom is an incredible person. I just also want to use this opportunity to let you know that my brother, I'm sure, would have loved to have attended the shiur, but because he has got some symptoms of his son has COVID, and my brother isn't feeling tip-top, until he's has a negative test back, I don't want to tax him because he's feeling under the weather with attending the shiur. But just know that I'd like to thank my brother and his wife, Jackie, for looking after my mom. And during her later stages when she had dementia, she stayed at the cottage on their house. And I can tell you something, without my brother's help and Jackie's help, I could never have coped. As a team effort, we all spent a lot of quality time with my mom. And I just, obviously, Arthur knew her very well, more than anybody in the group in the earlier years. And Arthur remembers one of the shiurim that he went to for Rabbi Tatz was, in fact, a shiur that my mom enthusiastically wanted to go to because she was a big Rabbi Tatz fan. I even remember she telling Arthur to keep the talking down to after the shiur because Arthur loved to chat. Even back then, you remember, Art? She loved you to bits though, but just during a shiur, she didn't want chatting, which I could understand. So do you remember that shiur, Art, with Rabbi Tatz when we went there with you, myself and my mom?
Yes, and that's why you have a mute button on this Zoom, because you can shut me up.
No, come on. Anyway, I'd like to thank you, and I'm going to get started, and I want to share a couple of ideas by Rabbi Akiva Tatz. Obviously, I cannot do justice to Rabbi Tatz, but if this cheers up my mom and Shemaim, and obviously the rest of you guys as well, I'd be very, very happy. So, you know, there was a discussion in the beginning that when there was the process of the inauguration of the Mishkan and the tabernacle, in the beginning of the Jewish people's exertion in the desert, the Torah describes in great detail the gifts that the princes of the tribes brought. And then obviously it mentions in juxtaposition immediately afterwards in Parsha Akiva, you'll know, it's Belachsha. Which Parsha is it afterwards?
Beshalach, Yitro.
Beshalach, yeah, that's it, the one with the Yitro, when it discusses the lighting of the menorah and the Mishkan. You would know because you're the great Lena.
Parshas Naso.
Correct. So before that, it discusses, all I know is I'm looking at the art scroll, and it discusses the various tribes and the princes that brought gifts on behalf of their tribes. And immediately after that, it discusses the lighting of the menorah and the Mishkan. Ba'alotcha, that's exactly it. Right. And okay. With Aaron, there was an interesting comment by Rashi that he was watching the process of the princes of the tribes bringing the gift, but his mind became anxious, right? And his emotions, sorry, I'm getting a little bit emotional thinking of my mom. So his mind became anxious and his emotions became distressed. Why? Because as Rashi said, him and his tribe had no part to play in this historic moment. And it wasn't from an eager perspective that he was coming from, because obviously Aaron, his entire life's purpose was to serve Hashem. And his divine service was an embodiment of that. I mean, all the temple service was from obviously Aaron and the Kohanim. But Hashem did feel his pain at not being able to serve in that manner also. And therefore Hashem consoled Aaron and assured him that you will light the menorah in the Mishkan. And that's why the two parshas are juxtapositions with each other. And his mind was relieved. But there's an interesting question that the Ramban asks, Nachmanides, and I'm just paraphrasing here. I can't obviously remember word for word because obviously Akiva is the laner. But the question that the Ramban asked is, why did Aaron feel bad that there was an event taking place that he didn't share in? I mean, had he forgotten that his part in the Mishkan was absolutely essential? I mean, with all the korbanos and the daily sacrifices and the ketoras, he was an integral part of the connection between the Jewish people and Hashem. You know, and it's not like, for example, Hashem chose this time to remind him of all the things he was involved in. So the thing of it is the Ramban mentions specifically the ketoras, the incense, because incense, if you have a look, is a olfactory connection to Hashem. What do I mean by olfactory? It's smell. It's purely smell. So it's the highest level of connection between us and Hashem, as the Ramban says. And I was interested into why. Because it says that it's a direct connection between the soul and the brain. And even if we do Havdalah, part of the process of Havdalah is smelling of the spices to obviously make the soul feel compensated for the loss of elevated holiness that it achieves on Shabbos. And for some reason, that smell of the spices is some sort of consolation for the soul. We also knew that when Adam HaRishon was created, Hashem breathed life to man through his nostrils. Okay, so there's definitely a connection with life, the life force, the sense of smell. And there's even a discussion, I remember learning from a Kiva Bibi about certain of the abilities that the Mashiach has. One of the abilities that the Mashiach has is the ability to determine somebody's spiritual level by smell. In other words, he can smell if somebody's lying. And he can smell the sort of purity at which somebody is conveying his communication. And that's described specifically as an ability that the Mashiach has. So even a smell, if you think about it, guys, can take you back to a childhood in a more real way than looking at a photograph. I remember smelling Youth Jew by Estee Lauder. It was something my mom's mom used to wear. And immediately it took me back to childhood in a way that seeing a photo couldn't do. So it's the one organ that connects obviously the soul and the brain with emotional sensation in a very present way that sometimes photos think have to think more in the recesses of your mind. Also, an interesting thing about the sense of smell that the one of the commentaries on the Ramban brings is that you can tell the spiritual, even on our lowly level. I'll give you an example. When you go to a mortuary where the soul has left the body, what's the first thing that would off-put you? It's not necessarily the look, because the physical process of the look, obviously you can see that the neshama is no longer there. But any of you that have worked at the Chevra Kadisha knows that there's a certain smell that occurs when there's death, especially when rigor mortis sets in and there's deterioration, etc., that the holiness of the soul has left a void. And what's left is the body, the animalistic side, which conveys smell. Even if you look at food, what do you do to make sure it's not going to kill you? What do you do, guys? You smell it to tell that it's not awful rancid. So that sense of smell is used even by people on a low spiritual level to determine if something is living or dead. So smell is very, very powerful. So how does obviously this relate is that the incense, the clitoris, is a very big connection between the soul and the body. Now, one of the things that is that I wanted to mention to you is that Hashem could have reminded Aaron about all the mitzvahs that he was doing, specifically the incense. That's what the Rambam says, to make him feel at ease, that he was actually connecting the physical with the spiritual. But why did he comfort him with the lighting of the menorah? The one thing of it is that if you look at the mitzvah that the princes of the tribes did do, is when they brought the gifts, Akiva will confirm this, is that the gifts were spontaneous in nature. What do we mean spontaneous? Is that there was a certain amount of creativity, of love, of expression, which doesn't generally occur in the mitzvahs in the same way because they're constrained and regimented. One of the things we learn is that it's a higher level often to do a mitzvah when you don't feel like it, but you're following instructions, then your creative ability to just do what spontaneously you feel like doing. That's the essence of servitude, that you work within the constraints of what Hashem wants, and we sometimes subjugate our own will or our own creativity of what we feel to be right with what we would be most pleasing to Hashem, because Hashem has got omniscience. He has got levels of understanding that we don't have, and there's a certain trust to know that if he wants us to do the mitzvah in a certain way, it's going to be for our spiritual benefit in a way that our own creativity couldn't ever reach that level of elevation. And it's much more difficult. So the fact of it is Aaron would have loved to have been involved with a mitzvah that was more an expression of love and creativity, which wasn't the standard fare in mitzvot. Akiva, am I wrong or am I right?
I think that there's very good points there.
So
from what basically,
yeah?
from what I don't to digress here, but from what I remember is that the princes they brought their sacrifices out of their own volition.
Correct.
There was nothing. There was There was no requirements, and they could bring whatever they wanted.
Correct. That's exactly what I'm saying. Is that it was an expression of creativity, of spontaneity, of using an opportunity in a personal and creative way. So the question that was asked is, how does Hashem telling Aaron that he can light the mitzvah of the menorah satiate that? Because again, the menorah lighting is very instructional. So what is asked here is, why would that seem to make him feel at ease when in fact it was the spontaneity that he enjoyed? He would have wanted to express in his own way. In other words, he was pleased to serve Hashem, but he just wanted to do extra. So how would follow an instructive protocol have put him at ease? Does that make sense? That's the question that was asked.
Very, very nice question.
Yeah. So the issue is that it wasn't only about that. It was about the fact is, it put him at ease because what he craved was an opportunity to be there at the beginning of the process. In other words, when he was told that he could light the first menorah, and he was told the impact that it would have thousands and hundreds of years later in bringing lightness to the world in a place of absolute darkness at the Jewish people at a later stage, and to be involved in the beginning of the process, that's what gave him joy, because the beginning of the process is in fact the entire creative process at which everything is built on. So that's what provided him solace. It wasn't a mechanical activity at all. Now, Rabbi Tatz also obviously brought certain other things up. is that how did he know that it was the beginning of the process? What he did is that the word Chanukah actually means inception. Actually, inception in deed and conception in thought. So inception means meaning that the very, very first creative process, not only in terms of its development, but also in terms of the implementation to set the stage. So, for example, there's certain things that the Avos have done that have built in within our character to be able to have certain amounts of spiritual resilience. One of the things we learned, like, for example, was Yosef, known as a tzaddik because he could resist Potiphar's wife and ran away from that situation. Whatever the spiritual DNA of the Avos did work in our merit to where we have those sort of innate characteristics, but it's only because the Avos did the work. And this was a case where Aaron did the work in terms of Chanukah. Also in the word Chanukah is the word chinuch. And what's the significance of that? Is the word chinuch is the start of a process. In other words, it's a derivative means where where everything comes from there. So you're training an impressionable young mind. You take a child, you give him an education, and you give him the foundations and you plant the seeds on which all things are built. In other words, you're teaching a soul how to think, how to develop. And that's what chinuch is. It's planting the seeds and the foundations. And that's where the word Chanukah comes from in terms of idea and root. So Aaron was satisfied because he wanted to be there at the beginning of the process where it all develops, because the rest is just mechanical. In other words, the rest is how it plays out. So, Rabbi Tatz mentioned, because he's involved, obviously, he was a practicing doctor, and he was saying that DNA genetics, they form the basis from a chemical composition to the fetus, to a child, to an adult. So in other words, the DNA code is everything, and the rest is just a timeline expression of how it's going to turn out. So once you've obviously able to study the DNA, you pretty much know the sort of genetic propensity in terms of intelligence, physical ability, etc. That doesn't take away free choice. All Rabbi Tatz was saying is that the DNA, the inception point, is what actually outlays the rest, which is almost set up as the puzzle unraveling within a certain timeline. So the genetical part, the spiritual DNA, the physical DNA, is the most important part. So, for example, he was also saying that ratzon, your das, in other words, you get an idea. And when you get an idea in a flash of light, the whole concept comes to you in almost a second where time stands still. And it's the articulation when you communicate it to other people or quantifying it in language in order to share it with other people, that's almost sequential. But the thought is already fully formed and developed in your mind. Obviously, with communication, you develop the idea further, etc. But it starts off as a concept, and you're bringing it into this world through mechanics, through communication, and through, obviously, implementation of ideas. He was talking about the Yesh Me'ayin, and he was saying that that's the divine flesh. And the rest is just logistical mechanics. So I'll give you an example. He was saying, for those of you that are married, if you buy your wife a surprise gift, it's not the mechanics of paying for the purchase and the delivering, etc., and having it sent by Uber to the house that obviously is the impressive parts. It's the thoughtfulness and the inspiration of buying a gift that's going to perfectly suit her needs or her wants, to put it more succinctly, and that particular flash of inspiration and care is actually the essence of the gift. It's not about the delivery and the payment, etc. So that's what Aaron wanted to be involved in, was in the formation of the idea. So what Hashem said to him was really the consolation, is that as long as you could be there for the formulation, then that would obviously make sense. Now, the one thing is he said that you're actually going to get comforted by the Chanukah in the future, not this one. But there were certain comparisons brought. Okay, one of those comparisons were the fact that originally, when the Chanukah, when the menorah was lit in the temple, apparently it had a divine sort of light added to it that was so intense that it would border on the miraculous. It was almost described as the light from the starting point of creation. And what the impressive part was Hashem said to Aaron that many centuries from now, when there's no longer Mishkan and the holy oil, the pure oil is defiled, when the descendants are going to decontaminate the Mishkan and actually use that purified oil, that's what's the impressive test, and you're going to be part of it. So the language was used was Chayecha, basically implying that their Chag is greater, because it's basically, although it's not going to be built on the miraculous, it's going to be based on a higher level of trial and tribulation. Okay. Now, there was just one other thing I wanted to mention to you guys, is that, let me just see if I can put it clearly. Okay, so yeah, so Rabbi Tatz did mention that the special light at the first lighting of the menorah had the light of creation, which Hashem hid for the tzaddikim. Apparently it was used at that particular first lighting, and there are 36 Chanukah lights. And what does that symbolize? The 36 hours of that divine created light that was hidden for the tzaddikim, from Adam HaRishon until obviously the time that he sinned. So that's what the 36 lights on the menorah correspond to in total. And he said that obviously it's an indescribable radiance that was so strong that it actually penetrated physical objects. Obviously the second temple was far less. The Shekhinah and the Aaron was missing in comparison in the second temple. But in a certain way, the process in the second temple was obviously at a higher level, because it's known as almost an issue of permanence. So I'll give you an example. Rabbi Tatz discusses the fact of it is that the light in any creative process shines twice. What do we mean? If you have a look at the first luchot, when the tablets came, and there was a lot of fanfare, the whole world knew that the first luchot were coming. It was miraculous that it could be read from both sides. The letters were suspended, but obviously we couldn't maintain that level. And we ended up getting a second pair of luchot, which Moshe carved himself. Am I right, Akiva?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think
I think you're right, yeah.
Hashem.
Yeah.
So what often happens that you can see in terms of the Jewish people is that there's this first initial creative process, and then it's too difficult to sustain, but it gives us an idea of what the ideal is. And then from that particular point, it's taken away so that we crave that ideal and know what we can aspire to, and we're given almost a mechanism that's more accessible to us, with the intention of having a vision of what we could really achieve. He even describes it almost as almost a romance, where in the beginning you're in love with somebody, but that love isn't real. It's almost your hormones kicking in to get you to make a lifetime of commitment. And obviously through years and years with the same partner and sharing a lifetime and children, you develop a far deeper love, but that's the love that takes a lot of work. He said it was interesting in the shiur that there was a bocher that came to him after 2.5 months that said, there's something wrong. I think I married the wrong girl. I said, what do you mean you married the wrong girl? I said, my heart skipped a beat every time I saw her. I've been married for 2.5 months and I'm really not over the moon anymore. Like, it's difficult. He said, if you still had your heart skipping after 2 months, you would have cardiovascular problems. He said you'd have bigger problems. He said it's absolutely normal that you're going to get to a certain stage where you no longer feel that flitting love, but you're feeling a sense that you need to work on things, and it's a bit of a challenge, but the love that develops is far more real and permanent and deep. And that is how it's compared to the first Chanukah, at which almost there was a radiance that was almost divine in light, from the light that was originally saved to the tzaddikim, to the light which we have to create in darkness, which seems mundane. In other words, every Jewish home lights a normal light, and it seems very ordinary. But in fact, to keep that relationship and that experience up with Hashem, when we haven't had the sort of clarity that they did in generations when there were open miracles, is a greater level in a certain sense of miracle. So there's almost the sense of development and creativity at which we can't sustain. One of the examples that he uses was, for example, when a fetus is originally created, it's taught in the womb by its own malach the entire Torah. And then it's made to forget the Torah that it's learned. So the question is, why would that happen? It would seem kind of pointless. And the reason being is it's not pointless at all, because when you get into the world and you start to develop your intellect and your heart in the right direction, hopefully, what happens is when you learn Torah, it's not as if you're learning it for the first time. It's almost like your soul is recognizing what it learned in its highest realm. And you recognize a concept to be true, because you wouldn't be able to recognize something is true if it's completely foreign to you. The only way that you're able to almost gravitate or resonate with it is because at a certain level, you knew it. You obviously were made to forget it in order to have the free choice to choose between good and bad. But there has to be a certain amount of recognizability in order for you to connect with the Torah. And that's why it's not a useless exercise that we learn it in the womb, even though we're meant to forget it, because now begins the work of your lifetime of actually acquiring it and having the merit to get spiritual reward by. And what's that spiritual reward? It's a connection to Hashem of the work that's achieved, because if it's given to you as a free gift, you haven't earned it. And if you haven't earned it, you're a taker. If you've earned something, and you've worked hard for it, you're not taking as charity, you're actually giving all of yourself, and Hashem, and you are aligned in the fact that Hashem is a giver as well. So the more you almost represent Hashem in his midot of effort and giving, etc., not that it takes effort from Hashem, as opposed to being a passive taker and a recipient of free gifts, the more you have in common with Hashem and the greater the relationship is obviously going to be. So that pattern always occurs in abstraction. In other words, you need that inspiration, which is vital, because you can know from that point exactly what it is you have to achieve. And then when it's gone in a flash, it hurts. That lack, that loss, that abandonment, that despair, is that emptiness to make you know that you have to strive towards something in order to fulfill that emptiness inside of you. But unless you knew what is achievable, there would be no sort of direction in how to develop yourself. But that's the test of character, to have the tenacity, self-discipline, and control to achieve your potential. So what Aaron obviously wanted to be a part of was part of that first creative process within the lighting of the menorah. So it would almost give a sense of the miraculous to the Jewish people, that even in times of darkness, that they could go back to that and have that sort of connection to Hashem, even when it wasn't easy. And that in a way is a greater achievement than when there's open miracles. But that first point is what obviously put Aaron at ease, to be part of that initial process. In other words, it was almost as creative as the princes bringing gifts of their own volition, because that was the starting point of creative giving. And so was this. But this was going to help, obviously, the Jewish people for centuries. And just one thing I wanted to let you know is it was obviously the same in the first and the second temple. The first temple, there were certain miracles, Akiva knows from Lainey, that never occurred in the second temple. The incense had stopped women from miscarrying. There were no flies by the meat that was shechted. Akiva, what were some of the others?
I can't think of it offhand. I think maybe the menorah maybe was in the first one, not in the second one, or maybe this.
Yeah, correct. So
you had, I think you had, in terms of the korbanos, the sacrifices. I don't think all of them were in the second as were in the first.
There's quite a few things in the second. Yeah, it was definitely a lower level. What's it called? Environment. It wasn't the same amount of kedusha as the first one. So all these things that you guys are saying, there was lesser of everything, I think, pretty much.
Exactly. So it was just interesting to read this because I never actually understood exactly why Aaron felt dejected and how this process of being involved in the mechanical activity, lighting according to halacha, were cheering her up when there was no spontaneity involved. But if this was setting the stage, which would inspire and create the Jewish people to have the strength to carry on for centuries, Aaron was very excited about that process. And it certainly appeased him and gave him great joy, and not from an ego point of view, but to serve Hashem to the best of his ability. So what I'm hoping is that this Chanukah, there's miracles for all of you and blessings this year, and just obviously including for my brother and Jackie and the kids and all of your families. And I just want to thank you very, very much. Obviously, I'm giving over some of Rabbi Tatz's ideas just by thought, and obviously I'm not as eloquent as him, but I just love this idea of understanding a little bit more from the Ramban about Aaron's thought process.
Yeah.
Amazing, Damon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was lovely. Thank you, Damon.
Pleasure, guys. Nice to see you. I know you're all exhausted. I can see.
James,
Yeah.
James, before you go, this is related to the Chanukah and all that stuff. Okay, this guy goes to this one rabbi and says to him, I understand that Chanukah is an important time, but what is marriage like? He says it's like the first 8 candles, like the first 8 days. You strive. He says the first 8 years, you struggle, you strive, you struggle every single day. He says that's amazing. Thank you for telling me about marriage. I appreciate it. And after that, she said, I don't know, I've only been married 8 years.
I don't know what to say.
Well, you said if nothing's easy, it's not worth the effort.
Listen, Arthur, I've got to hand it to you. Out of all you guys, Arthur's the only one that's been married for 20 years now?
21 years.
21 years. And all of us are in the single stage. So Arthur is incredible. And also my brother and Jackie have been married since 1999. Even longer.
Yeah, you're longer than me. 1 year longer.